Turning to page 21 of the calendar, House Bill 2077, a bill to amend and reenact a section of the code relating to the Emergency Services and Disaster Law of 2000, Firearms, Emergency Shelter. Report for the Committee on Militia Police and Public Safety.
The gentleman from Rockingham, Mr. Wilt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, House Bill 2077 eliminates the authority of any governmental entity to prohibit the otherwise lawful possession, carrying, transportation, sale, or transfer of firearms in any facility used as an emergency shelter during a disaster. I move the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading.
Gentleman from Fairfax, Mr. Simon.
Mr. Chairman, will the gentleman yield for a question?
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
Gentleman yields.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask the gentleman if he's aware when the language that he is striking from the code, the language that grants the governor the authority to suspend those rights in emergency shelters, when did that come into the code?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware of when it came into the code.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill.
Speaking of the bill.
Speaking to the bill.
Gentleman has floor.
Mr. Speaker, members of the General Assembly here. The answer to that question is 2006. All right, 2006, we passed this bill, and it said essentially that even during a state of emergency, the governor couldn't suspend people's Second Amendment rights because these are important fundamental constitutional rights. But we said, well, what about emergency shelters? What about when people are crammed together in these really tight living conditions, sometimes for as small as 8 or 9 people, sometimes in a school gymnasium, sometimes in an armory? What do we do in those situations? Don't you think it'd be unsafe? So we were permitted an exception. It says except, if the governor determines it's necessary for public safety in an emergency shelter. Right? I've gotten a lot of grief lately because I keep harping on this issue of the slippery slope, right? That you start with something and then it evolves into something else, and some number of years later you come back and you take away some of the exceptions, right? This is the example. It's hard to understand. You guys, when I say, it seems to me like you all want guns everywhere, including emergency shelters where women and children are huddled, where they're trying to grab whatever belongings they have. When they're under stress, they don't know how some of their missing families might be doing, how their property's doing, what's going on around them. And you want to introduce firearms to that situation. We had a bill that went to this exact issue 10 years ago and said, but don't worry, there's an exception. And now we're coming back to strip out the exception. And this is a classic example of this guns everywhere, everyone, all the time solution to a problem that doesn't exist. And I really hope that it's the pleasure of the body not to engross this bill and pass it to its third reading.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Rockingham, Mr. Wilt.
Speaking to the bill.
Gentleman has floor.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the gentleman's comments, but I would say that since that time that language was put into the bill, we've experienced some natural disasters. And in those situations where folks were crammed into facilities, there was immense travesties that was, enacted upon the folks that were crammed into those. And I guess at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, it comes down to a basic philosophy. Should we allow the citizens to protect themselves, or should we rely on whatever entity it would be to protect us? That, again, those resources are already going to be stressed because of the natural emergency of the disaster that's taking place. And I happen to trust the citizens to protect themselves. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Shall the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading? Those in favor of that motion will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
The bill is engrossed and passed to its third reading.